Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar. The topic is Mastering Mistakes in Sage 50 Payroll. And my name is Duncan. I'm your host and presenter. I am also joined today by my colleague Alice. She's standing by in the background, ready and waiting to answer any of your questions. Let's now take a look at what we'll cover in today's webinar. So for an introduction, we're going to explore some different types of mistakes that can happen within payroll and look at what you need to consider before making any corrections. We're then going to take a look at the options to go back and reprocess an earlier pay run. So this would include restoring a backup or using the rollback wizard to go back and reprocess the period where the mistake was originally made. We'll take you through some examples of some corrections as demonstrations, and then we'll talk about submitting the corrected values to HMRC. And this is done via an FPS adjustment. And we're going to finish the session by exploring more about adjusting employees' pay, making sure they've received the right amount following the correction, as well as discussing other adjustments you may need to make, for example, to payments to HMRC or to your pension provider. And then we're going to wrap up with some of the further support available, upcoming webinars, and a bit of information on our training services. So let's get straight on with our introduction to mastering mistakes. And we'll start by running through a few examples of the types of mistakes or what could go wrong when processing a payroll. So this is by no means an exhaustive list, but examples of payroll errors could be over or underpayments to an employee, a problem with a statutory payment, perhaps absence details recorded incorrectly. You might have used the wrong pay date when processing your payroll, or an incorrect tax code or NI category, or perhaps there's been an error with a pension. So plenty of things that could go wrong. We are only human after all, but the good news is there is always a way to correct it and make things right in your payroll software. So hopefully by the end of today's session, you'll be reassured and you'll have some good insight as into the best way to deal with any errors. So when you do discover a mistake, it's worth considering what options you have. So there are two main ways to correct a mistake in payroll. And the first and most simplest is to simply correct the error in your next pay run. So if, for example, you've discovered a relatively small over or underpayment, that could be easily corrected in the next pay run by simply increasing or reducing your employee's pay to make up for the over or underpayment in the previous period. And if you go down that route, it does mean that you don't need to consider any adjustments to recalculated periods in the past, as everything will be dealt with in the next pay run. The other way to approach correcting an error, though, is to go back and reprocess your payroll. So this will involve going back to the original period where the mistake was made and entering corrected values. Once you've done that, you do need to reprocess each period up to date for the affected employees. You would submit an FPS adjustment to report that correction to HMRC, and then you would calculate any adjustments to your employees' pay, HMRC payments, and other liabilities. And that's what we're going to be discussing in today's webinar in a lot more detail. So if you do choose the option of reprocessing, there are a number of things to consider, both before, during, and after doing the correction. So looking at before reprocessing, to make sure you're all prepared for this, you want to make sure that you do have all of the original information that was put through payroll. For example, copies of the pay slips, your P32 report for any periods you've made payments to HMRC, and things like historical nominal link reports if you use that option. You should also have a think about what you've done since that mistake happened, as that can inform what method you use to go back to reprocess. And something else to consider, particularly as we're near the start of a new tax year, is was that mistake made in a previous tax year? Because if so, you will need to break your correction down into two stages. And we're going to cover that. We'll go through an example later on in the webinar. So once you're prepared for it, you then need to consider how you're going to make the correction. So if you're going back to reprocess, there are two main options. You can restore or recover a backup, or you can use the rollback wizard. And I'm going to explain the differences between those options very shortly. You will then need to enter the corrected values for each period that you rolled back, and then you would produce new reports for each of those periods, and you would be able to then, once you've completed the correction and reprocessed up to date, calculate any adjustments to things like your employees' pay, HMRC payments, and then informing the relevant people. So HMRC will need an FPS adjustment following a correction, and your pension provider will also need to know about any differences to pension contributions as a result of a correction. So plenty of things that you'll need to keep in mind when you're going back to reprocess a payroll. But we will give you some demonstrations today, and we'll bring some of this to life with a couple of scenarios. So what we're going to do next is we're going to take a closer look at the restore and rollback option. And this will get you thinking about what might be the best method of correcting a mistake if you ever need to reprocess a payroll in the future. So we'll also give you demonstrations of both the restore and rollback option as part of this section. So first of all, restoring a backup. So what this is either restoring your own backup that you've taken via the backup wizard, or recovering an automatic backup that payroll takes each time you run update records. Now, restoring a backup is a good option to use if you're correcting a very recent mistake. So maybe you've updated the records, you've reviewed your pre-update reports, and then straight away you realize something's gone wrong, and you just want to get back to the point before you updated the record. And therefore, it is a good option if a mistake affects all or most of your employees. Now, it is really important to understand that if you restore a backup, this overwrites any existing data with the backup data. So anything that's been done in payroll since the point that backup was taken would need to be reprocessed. So if, for example, you need to correct your last monthly payroll, and you're thinking about restoring that monthly backup, but since that time, you've processed a number of weekly periods, you would need to reprocess both the monthlies and the weeklies back up to date if you were to restore that backup. And in those sort of scenarios, you might want to consider rollback as an alternative. We'll speak more about rollback later on. Now, if you do choose to restore a backup, you will be asked what files you want to restore. And I just wanted to make clear, whenever you're doing a correction, the only backup files you should restore are the data files. Now, everything else, for example, RTI files, pension data files, online services files, would need to be left as they are, because these represent actions that have already been taken. So if you were to restore RTI files, for example, and you've already done a submission to HMRC, the history of that submission would be overwritten. And when you've done your correction, payroll will then try to send a full payment submission containing the full values rather than just the differences compared to what you submitted earlier. So the key takeaway here is when you're restoring a backup to correct a mistake, you would only restore data files. Now it's different if you need to move your data to another location, to a new PC, for example, but for corrections, data files is what you need. So let's have a look at a demonstration of restoring backups. So I'm just going to jump to the demonstration now. So in today's demo, I'm going to be working with monthly paid employees. So the last period that I processed, and I can check this by reviewing the last updated and last FPS date columns, was my 30th of June payroll. So that is the last updated date. But let's imagine I've realized I made a mistake. I forgot to put through any of the overtime hours for that pay run. So I want to go back to a point before I updated records in order to make that correction. So to do this, I could restore my own pre-update backup. So that would be a backup that I took after I'd entered all of the payments for June, but before I updated the records, or I can use the Recover Wizard. Now, I actually organize my backups into a folder on my desktop, and this folder is backed up to the cloud. It's always a good idea to be able to access your backups, even if you didn't have access to your PC. So I name my backups with the month of the payroll and the word post-update or pre-update. So I've come up with my own system, and I would know that if I want to get back to before updating records for my June pay run, I would want to restore this backup that I took. You need to restore it using the Restore Wizard. You can't simply double click the backup file. So if I just bring Payroll on screen again, if I want to get back to before updating the records, I can go to the File menu and choose Restore. In the Restore Wizard, I would click onto Next, and because I'm making a correction, I would only select data files. I would click Next again, and then I have this Browse option where I can browse to the file that I want to restore. So if I click onto Browse, it's actually taken me straight there because this was the folder I last took a backup to. So I could choose my pre-update June backup, click Open, Next, and then Finish. And that will then overwrite my data files with the backup data. It'll prompt me to log back in, confirming the process date for that pay run. And if we review the last updated and last FPS date columns, we can see that last updated has now reverted to the May pay date. However, last FPS date is still saying June, which is correct because I did send an FPS at that point. So I'm now back at the point where I can go through and enter the corrected values. So I can go through, enter the missing overtime. I can produce a full set of payslips and pre-update reports. And if you're uploading payslips, it'll replace the previous payslips that were uploaded for that period. And once that correction is complete, I would update the records, and then I would do an FPS adjustment to submit the correction to HMRC. But we're going to look at FPS adjustments separately later on in the webinar. So that's one way I could have got back to the pre-update state. The other way I can do it is by using the Recover Wizard, and this will restore an automatic backup that was taken at the exact point that I updated records. This can be really useful if you don't have your backups to hand, or maybe if you've just updated the records and you've realized you've missed something, you've used the wrong pay date, something like that, gives you an easy way to go back to where you were. So just to show you how to access the automatic backups, first of all, to check it switched on, if you go to the desktop menu, bottom left corner, and click Options, within the Backup tab, the default setting is to enable automatic backup. So for most people, this will already be switched on. If it isn't for you, though, you can tick this box, and then in future, backups will be taken each time you update the records. And then if you needed to restore any of those backups, you can go to File and then Recover. So Recover is the option for the automatic backups. That takes you into the Recover Wizard. And when you click onto Next, it'll list all of the automatic backups for the current tax year. So in this case, I would choose the pay date I need to go back to. I would click Next and then Finish. And that will then overwrite the existing data with that backup data. And basically the same as restoring my own backup. It's taken me back to the pre-update state. So the last period that was updated was May. That means that I can now reprocess my June payroll. So that is how to access the recover and the restore option. I'm just going to restore my latest post-update backup just to get me back up to date. So I can start again, and we can then move on and talk a little bit more about the other option, which is the rollback wizard. So by restoring that post-update backup, you can see that my data has reverted back to being last updated in June. So this has taken me back to essentially where I was. So yeah, that is restoring a backup. Key point to bear in mind here, if it's your own backup you're restoring, you make it a correction, it's just the data files you would restore. And if you want to use the automatic backup, that is found via the recover option. So backup isn't always going to be the best option, particularly if a mistake only affects one employee or a handful of employees, or if it's further back in time. And the other option, which is probably used more frequently, is the rollback wizard. So this is different to restoring a backup, as it is not overwriting your payroll data. What this wizard does is it removes the payment history for selected employees only. So you're going to choose which employee or employees you need to roll back. You choose which period in the history you want to go back to, and then you would be able to reprocess from that point. So this is good to use if you're reprocessing earlier periods, if it only affects one or some employees, or if there's no backup available. Now, something to keep in mind is that if you do need to roll back to a date in a previous tax year, you will need to do the rollback in stages. So you would first roll back the earliest period in the current tax year. You would then set your process date back into the previous tax year, and you would do another rollback to go back to the original pay date you need to start again from. And we'll give you a demo of that scenario towards the end of this webinar. So let's now take a look at the rollback wizard. So we're going to go through and follow the steps to make a correction in payroll. We're going to stop at the point where we're ready to do the FPS adjustment, because I want to cover that off separately a little later on. So let's just jump back to the demo and we'll have a look at rollback. So for this second example, I have one employee where I forgot to process quite a large bonus payment in June. So we had a bonus run. This employee, for some reason, was missed out, not received his bonus, and I actually want to go back and reprocess that so that I can pay him the extra pay that is owed. So the employee in question is employee number 2. And just so that I know what they were originally paid, I'm going to print a copy of the pay slip for the June pay run. So this is the period I'm going to roll back. So if you're on your payroll tasks, if you have a look in the links pane, you've got an option for reprinting pay slips. You can pop a date or date range into this box. And I'm just going to enter the June pay date. And then you can choose a payslip layout from these folders. So I'm going to choose just a standard payslip layout, just so that I can print a record of what we originally paid this employee. So they just got their usual salary. I forgot to put through their bonus. These were the deductions that were made at the time, and this was the employee's net pay. So I can export it as a PDF or print it out. So I've got a record of what I originally processed. Now, if I've already made my payment to HMRC, it would be useful to have a copy of the P32 as well. So again, from the payroll links, there is a handy link for the P32 report. So if I need this, I can run it for tax month 3. And that's going to show me the amount I originally paid to HMRC for that period. So if there is a change in my liability as a result of this correction, I'll be able to work out how much extra I need to pay over. So a couple of the essential reports to run before you do the correction. So I'm now ready to run the rollback wizard. So for this, you would start by selecting the relevant employee. And then if you go into the tasks menu at the top of the screen, you can come down and select rollback. On the first step of the wizard, there is an option to take a backup. So if you don't already have a backup of your data as it is now, I'd strongly recommend you take one, just in case you want to undo any of this correction. Now, I already have a backup. I've just restored it, so I don't need to take a new one. I'm going to simply click onto Next, and that will then confirm the names of the employees selected. I can click Next again, and the rollback wizard will ask me to choose which period I want to go back to. Now, for me, the mistake was made in June, so it is just one period I'm rolling back. So I've already got that selected, tax month 3. I would click onto Next and then Finish. It confirms the process is complete. And if we review the last updated date, you can see that for this individual, that's gone back to the 31st of May because we've rolled back the 30th of June, with the last FPS date still reflecting the date the employee was last included in an FPS. And that's important because we're going to do an FPS adjustment later on to submit the correction. What I can now do is I can set my process date to the date I need to reprocess. So 30th of June in this example. I can go into the enter payment screen and I can enter the corrected values. So what was missing before was the bonus payment. It's actually £2,000. So I've popped that in addition to the original salary that I got from the pay slip. You can see that's increased, the tax and national insurance and the net pay. Would also affect things like pension contributions. So I would then be able to produce a new report, a new pay slip for this employee. So I could either print it or I could upload the pay slip. And once I've got that pay slip, I've got the information I need to work out the differences in the employee's net pay and also any potential differences in pension contributions that I might need to inform my provider about. So you would print any required pre-update reports. And as I mentioned, if you upload online payslips, you would upload a new one to replace the original. You would then update the records, but just for this employee. They're the only person you rolled back. You could take a backup at this point when you update the records. I'm just going to skip that and complete the update records wizard. And it then confirms the employee has been updated. It moves their last updated date back to the 30th of June. That was the latest period I processed. So that correction is now complete in payroll, and I'll then be able to work out what I need to pay to my employee. Now, next step would be to submit the correction to HMRC. But hold that thought for now, as we're just going to go back and recap what we've covered so far. So that there was the rollback wizard. So removing the payment history for the selected employees only. You can choose which period you want to roll back to. And if you need to, you can roll back to previous tax years. And we will show you that in another demo a little bit later on. So now that you've got a flavor of the different ways that you can go back to reprocess, I thought it might be good to do a bit of a recap, running through 5 scenarios or situations. And I'd like you to have a think about what you think the best option would be to go back and reprocess in each of these. So first of all, we'll look at a mistake that affects most employees. So would you restore, recover, or roll back? Then a mistake that affects just one employee. How about if there's no backup available? If there's an error discovered immediately after updating records, or if you need to go back several periods for an individual employee. So have a think now in your head of what you think might be the best option for each of those, and I will share my thoughts. And there's no wrong answers here, to be fair, but I will give you my opinion on best option for each of these. So let's start then with a mistake affecting most employees. So I would say the best option there would be restore or recover. So if you're going to need to reprocess payroll for the majority of your employees, if you restore back to the point the mistake was made, you've then got the opportunity to start again from that point. You can produce full sets of reports, with all of your employees included, and you'll be able to kind of generate the pay slips, pre-update reports, and update the records, taking a new backup. So if it is most of the employees, I would say restore or recover is probably the way to go. Comparing that then with a mistake affecting one employee, I would say for this one, rollback. So just the one employee, don't want to worry about reprocessing everyone else. So rollback wizard, I think would be ideal for that one. What if there's no backup available? Probably going to need to go down the route of rollback. Something you could consider if it was the last period is the recover wizard if you've got that switched on. But rollback can always be used even if there is no backup available. So the fourth one, you've just updated records, you've discovered a mistake. How might you do that one? I think for that one, the recover option is perfect. If I've literally just updated records, maybe I realize then, wrong pay date, forgot to put through the overtime, I could use the recover wizard to go back to the point where I know I'd updated the records. So I think that would be the best option in that scenario. And the last one here, you need to go back several periods for one employee. I think this one's a no-brainer. For that one, I would certainly use rollback. So wonder whether you agreed with those. Let us know in the chat if you want to. Now, what we're going to focus on for the rest of the webinar is submitting that correction to HMRC. So we have seen how to correct the payroll records, either by restoring a backup or using the rollback wizard. And whatever point you go back to, you will need to reprocess your payroll from that date back up to the current pay date. So if it was 3 months ago, you would need to reprocess 3 months of payroll, updating records as you go. Now, once you've completed the correction, at that point, you'll be in a position to report that correction to HMRC, and that would be done via submitting an FPS adjustment. So similar to an FPS, it contains the same information, but rather than reporting the full figures for that pay run, it will report the difference between the original FPS submitted and the corrected values. You need to do this once a correction is complete and payroll is back up to date. So at the point your last updated date and last FPS date are the same, you're then ready to send an FPS adjustment. Now, if you've gone back more than one period, say you've made a correction to a historical period, you won't see the details of the liability adjustment for that period, but it will contain corrected year-to-date values. So you would still send this once your reprocessing is complete to inform HMRC. So we're going to pick up our demo for the individual that we rolled back. So just jumping back to payroll, I can see now that my last updated and last FPS date match. So that's the last pay run I did. I've already sent an FPS, so I would not be able to send that again if I try to. It tells you the employees have already been included in an FPS. And that's a good thing because we don't want to submit the full values again. We only need to submit the differences. So what we do instead is an FPS adjustment. So when I click onto this, you'll see the first thing it does is it pops up with the late FPS payment screen. So we're submitting for a pay date in the past, and it's asking why this is being sent late. And if you open the list of reasons, The one that you would choose for any correction would be reason code H, which is a correction to an earlier submission. Once you've chosen that, you would click OK. That takes you into the FPS adjustment screen. If I click on to continue, and once I've checked my details, I click submit. You'll then see it only shows the employee selected, shows the tax period, and in this case, it shows a liability adjustment, which is the difference in the tax and the national insurance contributions between what we originally sent and the new payslip. So there's been an increase in tax and national insurance, including the employer contribution of 841.34 in month 3. Now, if we'd gone back to an earlier period, the adjustments to the year-to-date values are also included in the submission. And from here, we simply submit the FPS adjustment. That's then sent over to HMRC, and they can then use that submission to adjust the figures they have for that period. So that is the correction complete for that particular employee. But what I also want to show you is where we can roll back to an earlier period, and we can even roll back into a previous tax year if required. So I need to make another correction. I have an employee who has recently turned state pension age. So they had a birthday back in March, but because someone else has been doing the payroll, some warnings have been popping up. They didn't know what it meant. So they have continued to process them on NI category A, when in fact, they should have been switched to NI category C as of our March pay date. So looking at the history for this tax year, we can see the wrong NI category has been used. The employee should not have paid national insurance since they became state pension age. So the net pay they were originally paid is too low. Now, the first period I need to correct will be my March pay run, which is in the previous tax year. So when I do the rollback here, I will need to do it in 2 stages. And I'm also going to need to do 2 FPS adjustments, one for the previous tax year and one for the new tax year. So let's walk you through the steps now. So first of all, make sure you've got copies of the original pay slips. So top tip from the payroll links, go into reprocessing pay slips, enter a date range, and click OK. And then I've got this one added to my favorites. And I can actually see for this employee, they just get a fixed salary each period. The mistake has been that they've been on the wrong NI category. So I can see what they were paid originally. I can save as a PDF or print that out so I've got my own records. You should also make sure that you've got copies of your P32 for any of these periods, because there will be a change in the liability to HMRC. Now, to roll back to the previous year, you need to start by rolling back the current tax year. So I'm going to go to Tasks and Rollback. Do make sure you take a backup before you complete the rollback wizard. Just for time, I'm going to skip that. So we've got the right employee selected. And the earliest period I can roll back to in this tax year is tax month 1. So I'm going to select that in the list. I'm going to click Next and Finish. And when you see this message pop up that you've selected the oldest update, it's asking if you want to clear the following information. For this, you would always click No. So we do still need to keep some of these values. I want to completely clear them, so we're going to click on to No. Now you can now see that the last updated date has reverted to the March pay date. And this means that I can now go ahead and roll back the periods in the previous tax year that I need to reprocess. So I'm going to change my process date back into the previous year. So I'm actually changing it to the 31st of March, what will be the first pay date I need to reprocess. I'm then going to go back to Tasks and Rollback. I'm going to run through the rollback wizard, and this time I'm only going to remove tax month 12. So this was the first pay date that they should have been on NI category C. So with both of those rollbacks, the last updated date is now showing the 28th of February. The last FPS date is showing the last FPS for the previous tax year. And when we're doing this correction, we're doing it in two stages. We're going to correct the previous tax year and submit that correction. We're then going to correct the periods in the current tax year. Now, what I need to do to make this correction is to simply update the NI category to what it should have been at that point, which was NI category C. I can then go back into enter payments and ensure that I have the correct payments for that period entered. And the good news for me is that the pay doesn't change for this employee. They always get their fixed salary, £2,500. But what we're seeing now is that the employee is not paying national insurance, and therefore their net pay has increased. So it's now a case of reprocessing this period. So printing a new payslip or uploading a replacement payslip. I can then update the records. And I can then see my last updated and last FPS date match. So I'm all up to date for that tax year. And I will need to do an adjustment now for that period. Now, because this is for a previous tax year, we're not going to use the FPS adjustment option. Instead, you go to e-submissions and you choose amend a previous tax year. So if I go into that now, you'll see I've got an FPS late reason, which again is a correction to an earlier submission. And it does actually take me into the FPS adjustment submission. So I would click continue and submit. You can see the liability adjustment this time is a negative amount. It's effectively the employee's NI that's being refunded. And we would click submit to send that to HMRC. What you can then do is reprocess the periods in the current tax year. So starting with April, I would run through the payroll process, checking I've got the correct figures entered, printing new pay slips, updating the records. I'm going to skip past a few of these steps just in the interests of time. But once you have reprocessed each pay run up to date, of course, in reality, you'd be going through checking that you've got the correct figures entered. Your last updated and last FPS match. This is when I'm going to send an FPS adjustment for the current tax year. And that is then so correction to earlier submission. That's going to then report the correction up to month 3. So that is the rollback wizard going into a previous tax year. So just to start finishing up here, if you're going into a previous tax year, you would again use the amend a previous tax year option when you're ready to do the submission. But the thing to keep in mind is that you need to submit that amendment before you reprocess any periods in the current tax year. Liability adjustment reflects the figures for the last period submitted, but anything else will be included in the year to dates. If you do need to go back to a tax year earlier than 24-25, so more than 2 years in the past, our technical support team will be able to advise on how best to do that. So I've added the steps on this slide. You've also got a link to our article. So we fixed our payroll records. We've done our submissions to HMRC. Last thing to consider is the adjustments you need to calculate for your employees, HMRC, and anyone else that needs to be paid. So when it comes to the employee's pay, because you'll have original pay slips and corrected pay slips, the easiest way to work out what you might owe to an employee or what they owe you is to compare the net pay on each. So in that example where we missed out the bonus, we don't simply give them £2,000. That was the gross pay. We need to give them the difference in the net pay figure compared to what we had already paid them. So that can either be paid to them outside of payroll, or if you wanted to include it in next month's pay, you can do a post-tax, post-NI adjustment. So it's comparing original and corrected payslip to find the difference for your employee. When it comes to HMRC payments, it's a similar situation. So compare the original P32 and what you've paid to HMRC for that tax month with the corrected P32. So if you've underpaid them, you'll need to make an additional payment. If you've ended up overpaying them, you can deduct that difference from the next payment due. And then a few other points that you may need to adjust. So if a correction has resulted in a change to a statutory payment recovery amount, such as SMP or SPP, if you've already sent the EPS, you would simply submit another EPS, which will report the corrected year-to-date values. If a correction results in a change to pension contributions, you will need to calculate what the differences are, and you would follow your specific provider's process to submit and report those differences in contributions. So speak to them if you're not sure on the correct process to follow. And a quick note, if you do use the nominal link and you've gone back to reprocess, you will be prompted to post that nominal link again following a correction. So you could go ahead and do that and manually reverse the original journals for those employees. Or the other option would be to set your nominal link settings to post to file, post the periods that you've corrected and run reports rather than making direct postings into accounts, and then do a manual correction within your accounts. So our help center does contain some guidance on all of that. So that has actually brought us to the end of what we cover, and we are nearly out of time, but we're going to keep the webinar open another 5 minutes or so just so that you can submit any final questions. Just to mention some of the upcoming webinars this month. So we've got a session on processing payroll, get your payroll done. Next Monday, new starters, HMRC mailbox, a repeat of today's session, processing levers, payroll assistance, and variance reporting. So some interesting topics there. If you'd like to come along and learn more, you can sign up for all of these at sage.co.uk/webinars. Also, to let you know, our help centre is always available with useful support guides, a knowledge base, and you get a link to the webinars. And you'll also find all the contact details for our technical support team should you need to get in touch. So click on the help icons in Payroll or head to sage.co.uk/help. Just to mention, we also offer personalised training. If you would like a one-to-one remote training session arranged, you get expert one-to-one support tailored to your requirements, giving you greater confidence and accuracy, and no travel, saves you time and saves you cost. So you can scan the QR code, or we'll include a link to the enquiry form in our follow-up email. So I'll take this opportunity to thank you for attending the webinar today. Like I say, we'll keep the session open so you can have a read through the Q&A. Don't forget to download the handout before you leave us today. And we will send you a follow-up email, which will include a link to the recording of today's session. So if you missed any of it, or if you'd like to share that recording with any colleagues, you will be able to do just that. One final ask from me: when you leave us, we will invite you to take a survey. So it'd be great to know any feedback that you have on today's session. We do read it all, and it informs all of the improvements to keep these webinars the best they can be. So appreciate your time if you can complete that survey. So I'm going to go on to mute just briefly just to check on the questions, and I'll come back just before we're about to close the webinar down. So I'll speak to you soon. Hi again, everyone. Thank you once again for joining us today and for sending your questions through. I think we've managed to get answers out to all of them now, so do check those out before you leave us. We will be closing the webinar very shortly, so a reminder to take that survey when you leave us today. We'd very much appreciate your feedback, and also to look out for your follow-up email arriving later today. It'd be great to see you on some of our future webinars, so get yourself signed up to any sessions you would like to attend. But on behalf of myself and Alice, thanks again for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you on some other webinars in the future. It's goodbye for now.